number of years back, we got really concerned about trauma among spiritual leaders. This really emerged from a study where we consulted, and we found that faith leaders in a particular religious group were showing really alarming rates of symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And this seemed to be tied from the data we had to a number of the challenges that faith leaders face on the front lines of ministry work, which can include a lot of exposure to suffering of various types, a lot of challenges within congregations. In the data we looked at, there was a lot of reports of relational aggression and just an oversaturation, really, of dealing with complex suffering and difficulties in human relationships. And so we really wanted to understand better what was going on with the trauma exposure of faith leaders. So we did a follow-up study with a large sample of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim leaders, and it replicated the same findings that about a third of them were reporting symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder at a clinical level. Now, that really got our attention because that level of trauma symptomatology is higher than post-deployment military. So we were really struck by this need to better understand what are the risks and vulnerabilities of faith leaders. I think most of us who've been in those positions or worked around faith leaders, as I have quite a bit as a seminary professor and also as a therapist working with a lot of faith leaders over the years, I knew it was very stressful work. But I don't think there's really been widespread recognition of the overall vulnerability that our faith leaders can have in these important roles in our community that they occupy. Now, this research was before the pandemic, and more recent research that our research center has conducted is showing even higher rates of trauma vulnerability. During the years of 22, 23, we saw those rates increase to over half of faith leaders in a clinical range. We also have been looking at seminary students, and as I said, I've spent my career in theological education, so I was well aware that seminary students can have very different experiences. Some really thrive during that time, but there can also be vulnerability to high levels of stress and even trauma. And we found in our research that about 43% of seminary students during the pandemic were indicating a history of trauma and significant symptoms of trauma. So what does all this mean is an obviously important question that we're sitting with and trying to work on. We've come to an understanding that many of us, myself, I started out as a chaplain and did ministry before I became a psychologist. Many of us who go into these vocations have encountered experiences of suffering in our own background that as a strength can motivate us towards compassion to want to make a difference in the world. But that can also come with certain risks as well of our own vulnerabilities and our need to attend to ways that a lot of exposure to suffering can become overwhelming. And so we've also found in some of our work with seminary students that's going on that many entering seminary students not only show some vulnerabilities to trauma, but actually can articulate awareness of what some of their personal vulnerabilities might be to things like perfectionism, workaholism, low self-confidence, reactivity to interpersonal conflict. We've even had students voice that they realize they have some narcissistic tendencies, which I found encouraging they were willing to admit. So the problem isn't really that those going into these vocations, by and large, have no awareness of the vulnerabilities. It really is a question of what are we doing in terms of formation to try to help leaders who are willing to go to the front lines of ministry work grow, develop strengths of resilience, ways of getting the help that they need over the course of their careers.